Iron deficiency and anemia of chronic disease are two of the biggest problems in the world. In today's episode of Lab Stories, we're going to learn how to fix them. Welcome back to Lab Stories, where we help you understand your labs and optimize your health. In each episode, I'm going to bring a lab to life using stories, clarify the most common abnormalities, teach you what matters, what doesn't, and show you how to move from the red to the black. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Schexnayder. Let's go. The CBC is all about architecture. It's a numerical and structural analysis of the three blood cell lines, which are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Think about just turning on a microscope and looking at a slide of blood. Stratify the cells by type, count how many there are, and measure individual cell characteristics. That's it. If you missed the first episode, I covered that conceptually in way more detail, and it's fundamental to understanding your labs and optimizing your health. So go ahead and watch it now and come back. Don't you hate it when YouTubers say that? Me too. Okay, let's start with the story. Complete Blood Count Estates is a residential development being built in 4 phases. This is a hugely exciting project, and the building contractor is the ever-reliable Bone Marrow Building Company. The red blood cells are the houses. The Bone Marrow Building Company recently completed the first phase of home building, and it was flawless. There were no material or worker shortages. The finished houses were high quality, filled the whole neighborhood, and they all looked about the same. It was perfect. This is normal red blood cell production. Unfortunately, in phase 2, there was a severe ironwood shortage. But because consumer demand for red blood cell homes was constant, BMBC tried to build the houses anyway. They couldn't build as many houses, and the ones they completed were flimsier, uglier, and smaller. This is iron deficiency anemia. I use the term ironwood to highlight that iron is to red blood cells as wood is to homes. While iron isn't the structural support of the red blood cell like the 2x4 in a house, 4 atoms of iron are contained in each hemoglobin. The hemoglobin protein makes up 95% of the dry mass of the red blood cell. So the red blood cells are essentially just a bag of hemoglobin. Now, let's define hemoglobin, and I have a picture to help. Hemoglobin is a metalloprotein that contains 4 peptide subunits, specifically 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. And each peptide subunit, so 4, contains the heterocyclic pigmented compound heme. And each heme has an associated central iron atom. 4 peptides, each containing heme and iron. That is 1 hemoglobin. Got it? And the iron itself is what actually binds to oxygen to transport it from the lungs to the tissues. Without iron, hemoglobin can't be made properly. And no hemoglobin means no ability to carry oxygen. That's why the most important red blood cell test is hemoglobin, and why it is the measure we use to define anemia. Hemoglobin less than 13 grams per deciliter in men and less than 12 grams per deciliter in women equals anemia. Now, there are many causes of anemia in addition to iron deficiency, but iron deficiency accounts for like 50% of anemias. So that's why it's so important and the main topic of this episode. So if you're looking at your CBC and notice that you have low hemoglobin, aka anemia, your next steps in diagnosis will be found in the other red blood cell indices or size metrics. They can be divided into 3 categories. Characteristics of the group as a whole, which is hemoglobin, red blood cell count, and hematocrit. Characteristics of the average cell, which are mean cell volume, mean cell hemoglobin, and mean cell hemoglobin concentration, and how the cells compare to other cells, which is RDW. Remember, hemoglobin and hematocrit give equivalent information. Since most of the dry mass of red blood cells is hemoglobin, the volume of red blood cells naturally rises or falls based on hemoglobin. You'll notice hematocrit usually equals hemoglobin times 3. Next, though the MCH and MCHC are listed, just forget about them. MCV is really the only important mean cell measure and is actually the branch point used to classify anemias, as those with small cell volumes, aka microcytic, with MCV of less than 80 femtoliters, normal cell volumes or normocytic with MCV of 80 to 100 femtoliters, and large cells, aka macrocytic with MCV of over 100 femtoliters. Iron deficiency is usually microcytic, but you already know this. Less iron means less hemoglobin, which means a smaller cell. Iron deficiency anemia can also manifest as normal sized cells early on in the disease process, or if another type of red blood cell problem is present. To simplify, think of iron deficiency anemia as microcytic or anemia with small cells. Anemia of chronic disease, which I'll talk about next, either has small or normal sized cells. Now, back to the story. In phase 3, the chronic disease mafia took control of the ironwood supply chain. This shakedown left the BMBC without adequate supplies to build enough homes, even though there was no true material shortage. The homes they were allowed to complete were pretty normal in appearance. People that drove by this section of the neighborhood wondered why it looked so sparse, but they had trouble figuring it out. You know, the mafia is pretty sneaky. This is anemia of chronic disease. On the surface, it can look a lot like iron deficiency, but when you look closer, you see it's a problem with the supply chain, and the chronic disease mafia is what caused it. So how do we tell the difference? Well, let's look at the supply chain in more detail. The ironwood for home building comes from two places: new ironwood from China and recycled ironwood from old red blood cell houses. New ironwood from China is transported to the US on cargo ships. This represents dietary iron. After it's eaten, the ironwood cargo crosses the stomach ocean and docks at the duodenum. It's then unloaded into the intestinal epithelial cell ferritin storehouses. Next, it's loaded onto transferrin trucks and driven down the blood highway to the bone marrow building company to be used. Recycled ironwood is torn out of old red blood cell houses by macrophages and transported on transferrin trucks to the bone marrow. The BMBC is super environmentally conscious and uses mostly recycled ironwood. The transferrin trucking company, though, is not. The trucks are only filled with about 30% ironwood, and that's called percent saturation. Here's how the chronic disease mafia wreaks havoc on the ironwood supply chain, causing anemia of chronic disease. Harry Hepcidin, who's the chronic disease mafia boss, blocks the transfer of iron from the intestinal epithelial cell ferritin storehouses and the macrophages to the transferrin trucks. Even though the ironwood is in the body, it can't be transported to the BMBC and used to build homes. Harry Hepcidin also sends enforcers to the kidneys to decrease erythropoietin production and to the bone marrow building company directly, where they shake it down. The chronic disease mafia, though, has their price, so paying them off allows everything to return to normal. In summary, the chronic disease mafia blocks absorption and recycling of iron to create a functional iron deficiency. Even though the iron is in the body, it can't be used to make red blood cells. And the chronic disease mafia also directly decreases EPO and inhibits the bone marrow itself. Now let's define iron studies in more detail. Ferritin is the iron storehouse protein. Low ferritin means low iron stores in the body. Ferritin of less than 30 nanograms per milliliters in the presence of anemia equals iron deficiency anemia. And other studies aren't even needed. Ferritin has one key flaw though. The protein is an acute phase reactant, meaning it's elevated in states of inflammation. So someone could be iron deficient and have a normal ferritin level because the ferritin that is secreted by the liver in acute inflammation does not actually contain any iron. When ferritin is between 30 to 100 nanograms per milliliter in the presence of anemia, iron stores are either borderline or low, but ferritin is elevated because of acute inflammation. And a trial of iron supplementation is still warranted, even though anemia of chronic disease may be the real culprit. Ferritin of greater than 100 nanograms per milliliter indicates normal iron stores, and other causes of anemia are more likely. That's all for ferritin. Now let's talk about transferrin. The transferrin trucks are looked at in two ways. Number one, total iron binding capacity, or TIBC, tells you how many transferrin trucks are on the highway. Number two, transferrin saturation tells you how full those transferrin trucks are with iron. Saturation is a percent and is calculated as serum iron over TIBC times 100, which is the amount of iron over the amount of trucks times 100. Serum iron is often reported separately but doesn't add any additional diagnostic information to the ferritin TIBC or transferrin saturation. In addition to hemoglobin and MCV, iron studies are all you need to diagnose iron deficiency anemia. And here's a chart that illustrates some of the variability in red blood cell and iron studies in different disease states. But overall, just remember that if you're anemic with low MCV and low ferritin, you have iron deficiency anemia, and no other studies are needed. If MCV is low normal and ferritin is between 30 and 100, there could be both iron deficiency and anemia of chronic disease. If ferritin is over 100, iron deficiency is not present. TIBC tends to be inversely correlated to the ferritin level. Low ferritin iron stores mean no iron is available to be loaded onto transferrin trucks, so those trucks are empty and have a high total iron binding capacity. High ferritin, on the other hand, means there's plenty of iron to fill the transferrin trucks, resulting in them having low total iron binding capacity. Percent transferrin saturation, remember, is just another way of looking at how full the transferrin trucks are. Low saturation means low iron cargo and is typical of iron deficiency anemia and the combination of iron deficiency anemia and anemia of chronic disease. If it's just anemia of chronic disease, though, remember, the supply chain breaks down at multiple points, so the ferritin storehouses could be full and the transferrin trucks empty, or both the storehouses and the trucks could be full, but the iron isn't delivered to the bone marrow to be used. I've linked a chart for reference if you're still confused, and I'm going to say it one more way to make sure you understand. If ferritin is less than 30, you have iron deficiency. Transferrin saturation is also usually less than 20%. If ferritin is between 30 and 100, and transferrin saturation is less than 20%, you may have iron deficiency, but probably also have anemia of chronic disease. In that case, a trial of oral iron supplementation is still indicated. If ferritin is over 100, you don't have iron deficiency. Do you have a chronic disease like diabetes, obesity, heart failure, COPD, or chronic kidney disease? You probably have anemia of chronic disease if that's the case. Remember, fixing anemia of chronic disease requires paying off the chronic disease mafia, and I can help you pay them off with my free weight loss checklist that I've linked in the description below. All that I require is your email address, a like, a subscription, and a biceps emoji in the comments. Now, let's talk about the life cycle of iron in the body. Iron is a dangerous and reactive metal that cannot be left alone in your body. It's always accompanied by a storage or transfer protein or heme, and it can last forever in the body. It literally gets used over and over. Iron is absorbed in two forms in the intestine. Non-heme iron, which is found in nuts, vegetables, legumes, fortified cereals, and supplements, and heme iron, which is part of myoglobin, the metalloprotein cousin of hemoglobin that's found in muscles, which you may know as meat. The redder the meat, the more heme iron is present in it. Beef and game meats have more iron than chicken. Here's the important point. Heme iron is absorbed by a different and more effective mechanism into the intestinal epithelial cells than non-heme iron. Absorption of heme iron is in the range of 15 to 35% and non-heme iron around 10%. So to start fixing iron deficiency, you have to stop the blood loss and make sure you're eating an iron-rich diet that includes heme and non-heme sources. If you're already iron deficient, you could have a body iron deficit of 1,500 milligrams, as was shown in one study of over 4,000 patients. This means it would take over 7 months to replete that deficit if you took ferrous sulfate with 65 milligrams of elemental iron daily. Take the deficit, 1,500 milligrams, and divide it by 6.5 milligrams, or 10% of 65 milligrams absorbed daily. 1,500 divided by 6.5 equals 230 days, or 7.7 months. And this is the best case scenario. You can't ingest pure positively charged iron for many reasons. So it's chelated, complexed, or neutralized using another molecule. And there are 4 main categories of iron partners, if you will. Inorganic ions like sulfate, organic ions like gluconate or citrate, amino acids like glycine that you'll find in iron, bisglycinate, and polysaccharides, which are chains of sugars, and they come in pills and liquids. My highest ranked iron supplements will be linked in the description. I don't take these myself because I'm not iron deficient, but if I had to take some, these are the ones I'd choose. But back to the specifics. With iron supplementation of any kind, up to 40% of people experience unpleasant side effects like constipation, nausea, abdominal pain, and dark stools. This makes perfect sense because you're ingesting a highly reactive iron molecule that dissociates into its ionic reactive form in water and interacts with your intestinal lining and smooth muscles as well as the pigment in your stool. To minimize side effects of oral iron, there are 3 things you can do. Take the supplement less frequently than the 2 to 3 times daily that they're traditionally prescribed. So you take it once daily, once every other day, or even once a week, whatever you can tolerate. Research actually supports this and has shown that taking supplements once daily or every other day not only minimizes side effects, but actually can optimize absorption compared to multiple daily doses, especially if the iron is taken between meals, on an acidic stomach, and accompanied by vitamin C, which you'll for that reason find in a lot of oral iron supplements as a combination. Number 2, switch formulations. Ferrous bisglycinate may have less side effects than ferrous sulfate. And number 3, try liquid instead of pills. But the granddaddy of them all is IV iron. The benefits of IV iron are no GI side effects, just a few doses, and complete absorption. The downside is cost, and it requires a doctor's prescription. If I had iron deficiency anemia, I would definitely talk to my doctor about IV iron. So let's recap your iron deficiency reversal strategy. Number 1, find and fix the source of bleeding. Is it heavy menstrual bleeding, gastrointestinal bleeding, daily nosebleeds, anticoagulant use with slow bleeding? Figure it out and fix it fast. Number 2, optimize your diet. Eat high quality red meat multiple times weekly, in addition to non-heme sources of iron like nuts and vegetables. Eat as healthy as you can. And number 3, pick your supplement, oral versus IV, and if oral, pick the formulation type, dial in the frequency that works for you to minimize side effects, and try liquid if the pills are still too much. Take your supplement under the right conditions also, which are an empty acidic stomach and alongside vitamin C. Again, my favorite iron supplements are linked in the description, and I'd like to know yours as well. So please leave me a comment if you have one that's better. Many of you here don't have anemia. You just saw a red number on the CBC and were wondering if it matters. Well, hopefully this will put you at ease. If your hemoglobin is normal, you're basically good from a red blood cell standpoint. If your hemoglobin is low, you have a problem, and all of your other red blood cell indices, including hematocrit, MCV, MCH, MCHC, and RDW, will probably be abnormal as well. But isolated mild increases or decreases in those without an abnormal hemoglobin are generally discarded as not clinically relevant or meaningless. Also, the closer it is to normal, the less concerned we are. So if things are off just a little bit, it either doesn't matter or is an early indicator that something is starting to go wrong. Not trying to put fear in you there, but I would have it rechecked at a multi-week interval when you're feeling well and act on the result if still abnormal then. And remember, the test characteristics themselves dictate that 5% of us will fall outside of the normal range. That's the definition of a 95% confidence interval, and you could be one of those people. If that is you, you'll have stable, abnormal lab values over your lifetime, and you'll be asymptomatic. Tune into the next episode of Lab Stories where we meet Berry B12, frank folate, and alcohol, very important causes of macrocytic anemia that you don't want to miss.